This video was brought to you by Ground News. 2024 was a good year for Javier Milei. In his first year in office, the new president cut both Argentina's fiscal and current account deficits, brought inflation down from its heady highs at the end of 2023, and even got the economy out of a recession in the third quarter of last year. However, while things are generally looking up, one persistent issue for Milei is the peso. When he first came to power, Milei promised to do away with the peso entirely by dollarizing the Argentinian economy. But a year in, this feels a long way off. The peso's real value on the black market is falling, and his attempts to simplify Argentina's complicated currency regime, which would be a precondition to dollarization, aren't going well. So in this video, we're going to explain why the peso has always been Milei's biggest problem, his plan to fix it, and why it's not working. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, to understand why fixing Argentina's currency has proved so difficult, you need to understand why it was broken in the first place. In short, unlike most developed countries, which have free-floating currencies, for the past few years, Argentina has had effectively two exchange rates: the official rate, claimed and managed by the government, and the unofficial or actual market rate, known as the blue rate. The official rate has almost always been lower than the blue rate. Before Milei took charge, for instance, the official rate was about 370 to the dollar, while the unofficial rate was about 1,000 to the dollar. In other words, the government would claim that the peso was more valuable than it actually was, largely so that Argentinians and the government could afford more imports. Unfortunately, while that might sound great, there are a whole load of problems with this system. For starters, defending the peso's official value was difficult. Milei's predecessor, Alberto Fernandez, had to rely on a complicated system of currency controls, price freezes, and import restrictions to limit how frequently Argentinians could sell their pesos at the official rate, thereby relieving pressure on the currency. And even then, that wasn't enough. The official rate fell steadily throughout his presidency, and the Argentinian central bank still burnt through most of its reserves defending the peso. On top of that, Argentina's complicated currency system deterred foreign investment and encouraged a current account deficit. In other words, encouraged Argentina to reliably import more than it exported, which is one of the big reasons that Argentina has had to regularly go to the IMF for bailouts. Anyway, for all of these reasons, Milei has been trying to unify the two rates. This is also a precondition for Milei's ultimate plan to dollarize the Argentinian economy, because you need a settled and stable exchange rate to convert your pesos into dollars. Anyway, to do this, in his first month in power, Milei cut the official rate by 50% to 800 to the dollar, and said that he would further devalue it by 2% every month. The plan here seemed to be for the official rate to keep coming down until it eventually matched the blue rate. Now, Milei presumably hoped that the blue rate would actually increase once he cut government spending and got the central bank to stop printing pesos, because this would mean fewer pesos in circulation, which would make them more valuable. With the official rate falling and the blue rate rising, at some point the two would meet, and then Milei could unify the currencies and switch to a floating currency, like most other developed economies. Unfortunately for Milei, so far this hasn't happened. While there was a moment towards the end of last year when it looked like the two currencies would converge, in the past month or so the blue rate has been falling faster than the official rate, and the gap between the two of them has only widened. That is in part because inflation, which is still running at above 100% year on year, has eaten away at the real value of the peso. Paradoxically, one of the big causes of this inflationary spike has been Milei's decision to devalue the official rate, which has made imports more expensive. This has left Milei with a difficult catch-22. If he accelerated the crawling peg, i.e. devalued the official rate faster, which was the most obvious way of trying to get the official rate to catch up with the blue rate, he risks stoking more inflation, which could actually accelerate the decline of the blue rate, ultimately widening the gap between the two. However, if he instead stuck with the crawling peg, or even slowed it down, while this might reduce inflation, and therefore the decline of the blue rate, it would probably take longer for the two rates to unify. On top of all of this, Milei has to keep his eye on the upcoming midterms due in October of this year, when half of the lower house and a third of the Senate are up for re-election. Milei's political party currently has very minimal representation in Congress, and while he's coped impressively well so far, he'll want to perform well at these elections. This might be why a couple of weeks ago he announced that beginning in February, he'd actually be slowing the crawling peg from 2% a month to 1% a month. While this might delay the peso's unification, it'll play well with voters, given its disinflationary consequences. For context, while inflation has come down from its heady highs late last year, when it was running at over 25% month on month, it's still running pretty high at 3% month on month, or over 100% year on year. And the month-on-month rate actually rose slightly between November and December, from 2.4% to 2.7%. However, there is at least one big risk for Milei here. In short, because the official rate is still too strong, Milei and the Argentinian state will have to spend their limited foreign exchange reserves defending the currency's official value. This is a real risk for Milei because Argentina doesn't have that many reserves. While Argentina's reserves have risen from their December low of just $20 billion, the latest data puts them at just $25 billion, down from about $60 billion in 2019. This just isn't that much of a cushion, especially when you factor in the fact that Argentina's debt servicing costs are expected to rise sharply between 2026 and 2028, and it's not clear if Argentina will be able to weather any external shock. For instance, if Trump were to impose massive universal tariffs, this would push up the value of the dollar, as markets anticipate inflation and interest rate hikes from the Federal Reserve, which would make it more attractive to save in dollars. In this case, defending the peso would become even more expensive, potentially forcing a rapid and destabilizing devaluation. Much of this depends on the IMF though, which are currently negotiating a new program with Milei. While they've occasionally pushed Milei to accelerate the peso's unification, the IMF have been impressed by Milei's reforms so far, and if you can convince them to hand over a few more $1 billion, he'll have a better buffer to weather any external shock. Regardless, this story is expected to rumble on, with much of the world glued to what's happening with Milei's, frankly, quite wild and unique style of governance. In fact, last year when it was announced that Argentina had left recession, 103 outlets from around the world covered it, 36% from the left and 28% from the right. If you compare the headlines, you will start to see some interesting framing emerge, with the right focusing on the successful exit from recession, while the left highlighted the massive cuts Milei made to make this possible, and their major social impacts. And this is all possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organize them by story, with each coming with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting. All backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For instance, if you only read left-leaning outlets, you probably missed this story about Milei's speech from Davos, where he remarked that the woke global left are starting to crumble. You can immediately see that 165 outlets are reporting on this story, but of those, only 27% lean left, while 69% lean right. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias, and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers every story you see online. And best of all, Ground News are currently offering viewers 40% off Round's Vantage plan, which includes access to all of their amazing features, like their blind spot feed. This is their biggest discount of the year, so go to ground.news/TLDR, scan the QR code on screen, or use the link in the video description to subscribe today.